A chase through the jungle and the discovery of a major island landmark gives us a glimpse into the future of what this show is about to become. Welcome to the Lost Explained episode guide, where we will be exploring and explaining the TV show Lost, episode by episode, mystery by mystery. Now, this guide is full of spoilers from top to bottom, so you have been warned in advance. The 11th episode of Season 1 brings us back around to Jack again, and we start to see the cracks in the man begin to appear as he goes after a kidnapped Claire and Charlie, with Kate by his side, Locke in the lead, and Boone, well, just tagging along behind and trying to be useful. This straightforward episode is a shot to the arm in terms of pacing, but it remains a bit of a trick. While it looks like there is a lot happening, really nothing much is happening at all, and I'll explain that once we get into it. This is the first episode of Lost where you couldn't just drop into the show without having full context of what went on previously. It is totally reliant upon the last episode's ending in order to be understood, and ends in a way that does not resolve the dilemma and actually leaves the conclusion open for a later episode to resolve. It's also unique in that, as a story, it forms one long chase, something that we won't see again until Season 2's The Hunting Party, which follows a similar formula and, in my opinion, actually does a better job of juggling character with action. All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues is an early marker of where Lost is going to go in terms of its faster pacing, its more consequential tone, and the overt serialization of the story. Our characters aren't just trying to survive and thrive or find a way off this rock here. Now they are being attacked from an unknown enemy and trying to get back two of their own. The stakes are raised and have more weight to them. It feels personal because we have gotten to know and like these castaways over the past 10 episodes, and they have broadly grown to like each other, or at least rely upon each other. But now they are under collective threat, and this gives them something to rally together against, and their infighting will eventually take a backseat to the bigger existential threat of the others. All of that really starts cooking here in this episode. The pacing is definitely up compared to the first half of the season, in which there was plenty of time to sit around and eat fake peanut butter. Now we are jumping headfirst into danger and drama, and the tension is palpable. No time to stop and smell the imaginary peanut butter now. We have Ethan on the loose. Currently, he is the face of the others, and he's gone from being a creeper lurking in the background to a full-blown arch-villain who has emerged from the darkness of the jungle to snatch two of our losties away to God knows where. William Mapother is effectively intimidating and scary in this episode, as he also will be in Homecoming. He really sets the standard for the others. There is something very unsettling about the way he looks and behaves. Locke is doing his level best to track the man through the trees, all the while he has Jack on his back and Kate and Boone in tow. The episode essentially becomes a vehicle for Jack as he powers on ahead, which helps us to see another side of the man. We witness his bull-headedness materialise in the midst of this dilemma. He struggles with the idea of failing, not wanting to accept defeat. This will become one of his defining character traits going forward. I also suspect that this is where some of the anti-Jack critics first started finding his behaviour frustrating. However, on a psychological level, Jack is wrestling with a failure of his leadership to keep these people safe. And even worse, his failure to believe that Claire was being attacked and stalked. So it's this guilt that is driving him forward. He feels that this whole situation is his fault to some extent, and he lashes out at people around him. In this case, both Locke and Kate taste the saltiness in the air, and we see that Jack frequently follows his heart over his head. The guilt bug seems to be going around too, because Locke also feels responsible for the abduction. He claims that he should have known that something was off about Ethan, as they apparently hunted together off screen.
Jack, this was my fault. What? I hunted with Ethan, I spent time with him, I never sensed anything off.
It seems that Locke doesn't always recognise danger and ulterior motives when he is looking it in the eye. Worth noting. This line about hunting with Ethan is very interesting when we consider a scene in Season 5 opener Because You Left, in which time-travelling Locke encounters Ethan by the Beechcraft. This is several years before Oceanic 815 crashes, which means much like privileged members of the upper echelon of the others, such as Richard, Eloise, and Charles Widmore, Ethan had been anticipating the arrival of John Locke for some years now. Could this be why he makes a specific effort to spend time and go hunting with the man? Perhaps being close to Locke would feel like hanging out with a celebrity, someone whom the others were no doubt rapidly discussing behind the scenes. We see more evidence of this in Season 3 episode The Brig.
Don't mind them. They're all just excited you're here.
Excited?
We've been waiting for you.
Anyway, the foursome decide to split up and follow different trails to see where they lead. Kate proves to be capable of doing some tracking herself, having spent time in the woods with her military dad, Sam Austin, as a kid. And that leaves Locke and Boone a chance to bond. Their scenes in this episode are clearly designed to pair them together for the remainder of the season. Boone needs to feel a sense of utility to the group, which up until recently he has lacked, while Locke benefits from having a helper, someone younger whom he can teach and bounce ideas off, maybe even confide in. Perhaps the most memorable part of the episode, other than Charlie hanging around, is when the two men stop to swap backstories. Boone is much like the audience was before we saw the flashbacks in Walkabout, assuming Locke to be some kind of badass, and he is equally surprised to find out that Locke was just in fact an everyman with a boring office job. Then Locke makes a weather prediction that actually comes true, and it's just such a lovely moment between them, so much so that it makes Locke's greatest hits in his Island Flash's awakening in the end. I think this moment in the rain is what draws Boone into the mystical nature of the man. He senses that there is more to this guy than meets the eye. Little does he know that by following Locke further into the jungle, he is also walking one step closer to his own tragic fate. Elsewhere, there's a lot of running and yelling into the trees going on with Jack and Kate, followed by a really well-staged fight scene in which Jack gets his ass whooped. Ethan's impressive physicality was initially seen by viewers as an almost supernatural demonstration of strength, playing into the idea that the others weren't going to be just normal human beings. I remember when people were absolutely sure the others were going to turn out to be aliens in disguise or demonic superhumans from hell. But by the time Season 3 shows us that even the island's fertility doctor knows how to whoop some ass, these theories died a death. I think we should be grateful that the others weren't turned into something otherworldly. Juliet tells Jack in Season 4 episode The Other Woman,
"People a therapist?"
It's very stressful being another, Jack.
Perhaps part of that stress involves intense training, including weapons handling and hand-to-hand combat. The others have to be ready for war at all times. They're here to protect the island from outsiders, after all. Jack and Kate's part of the chase gets capped off with an almost death scene featuring Charlie, which we'll get into in a lot more detail in just a little bit. There isn't much going on back at the beach camp beyond a pretty awesome scene between Saeed and Sawyer that really helps to progress their dynamic beyond the antagonism. Sawyer essentially toys with the idea of getting even with Saeed, and Saeed, never being one to beat around the bush, calls him out.
Have you got something to say to me, Sawyer? Or are you going to continue asking me questions you know I don't have the answers to?
Instead, Sawyer decides to let bygones be bygones. This is a massively significant character moment, all too easy to overlook because of how gentle and undramatic it is. The point is that Sawyer has forgiven the man for torturing him. He walks away without vengeance in his heart. This is a big deal for the bad boy of the oceanic survivors. He even kept Saeed's signal fire burning, and we see the look of surprise on Saeed's face. They might actually be able to move past their differences and prejudices, and part as equals. I really love this scene and everything that it represents for the future, and it won't be too long before we see these two guys partnering up, with their initial ugly history a dim and distant memory. The Jack-centric flashbacks give us the first proper insight into his dysfunctional relationship with his father, Christian Shepherd. I've said it already about how much I love the chemistry between Matthew Fox and John Terry as father and son. They are such a great pairing, and the fireworks are always guaranteed to pop whenever they are on screen together. We're actually catching them at the end of their storyline here, with the son finally surpassing the father. Christian's alcoholism is something that will be explored in greater depth in future episodes, but the impact it has on Jack is profound. It is often said that we become our parents, or eventually follow in their footsteps in some way. In Jack's case, it is 100% true. Not only did he follow Dad into the medical profession, he also became a spinal surgeon, then later fell foul of the same addictions too. The need to suppress one's guilt, one's pain, or one's shame. Christian's addictions have spiralled out of his control, and he can no longer go home and simply shake off a bad day with an after-work drink. Now he is drinking at work, inebriated whilst on call and on the job, forcing Jack to step in to save the day, which is a scene that will be later ironically echoed by a Season 5 flashback to Jack's first residency under the watchful eye of dear old dad when things also went wrong.
So close your eyes, count to 5, and then fix her, Jack. Or I'll have to fix her for you.
A moment in which Jack learned that he could fix things if he only committed hard enough and ignored his own fears and doubts, which is something that marries well with his on-island story in the search for Claire and his overall character arc. The problem is, Jack, sometimes you can't fix everything. Sometimes things stay broken. Part of letting go is accepting that we can't control everything. Some things are in the hands of fate. However, flashback Jack can't bring himself to ignore the doubts he has about his father by the end of the episode, especially when he comes to realise that not only was a patient's life lost, but also the life of her unborn child. There is a really great key scene that precedes this, in which Christian pleads with Jack to co-sign a BS statement to back up his dad's account of events. This is truly the worst form of nepotism in action, when those in powerful positions dodge accountability because they have insulated themselves with family, friends, and favours. Jack is a very moral man, and I admire that about the character. He really believes in an absolute right and an absolute wrong, but he can be led astray by his emotions, which is why Christian manipulates the conversation when he says,
That is why you are the most gifted young surgeon in this city.
Now, we all know that Jack has always wanted his father's approval, or to at least be seen as worthy of having what it takes to succeed and be a great doctor, maybe even a great man. And Christian knows that Jack craves this validation from him desperately, yet he has spent a lifetime denying his son that emotional fulfillment. It is only when Christian's entire career and reputation is on the line that he tells Jack how he really feels about his talents, and we can see by Jack's look of utter surprise that he has never heard this before. But of course, Christian knows what makes his son tick, and whether he believes in Jack's abilities or not is immaterial, because this is him essentially giving Jack love in order to get some love back. It is such a brilliant scene, layered and complex, with lots of subtext going on beneath the surface. Of course, Jack does eventually choose to save his father, just not in the way Christian expected.
I need to revise my statement.
For me, this is one of Jack's best flashback stories, as it really provides a gripping personal and ethical dilemma for him to grapple with, defending his father or defending his oath to do no harm. This is what Lost does better than almost any other show. Now here's my hot take. I actually think the flashbacks are more dramatically interesting and rich than what is happening on the island, which is very rare in Lost. Don't get me wrong, All the Best Cowboys has lots of good stuff happening on the island, but the problem I have is how everything that happens ultimately amounts to nothing in terms of consequences. We are no further along than we were when we first saw Charlie and Claire staring down Ethan in the jungle at the end of the last episode. This whole jungle chase is ultimately just the characters running in place. The writers buying more time as they figure out where the second half of this show is going to go. Sure, there are multiple dramatic events taking place. The Jack and Ethan fight, Charlie's resuscitation, Locke and Boone finding something in the ground. But things happening on screen is not always equal to a story being told. Stories are about causality, how one thing leads into the next. Every choice and reaction must have a consequence in the chain. Whereas here, it's all just for show as far as I'm concerned. The Jack versus Ethan fight is a dead end. Sure, we see that Ethan is physically strong, but this amounts to nothing later on when the rematch happens in Homecoming and Jack bests Ethan. Charlie is found hanging by his neck, dead, but then is instantly brought back, thereby feeling a bit like a cheap trick on the audience. And the artifact that Locke and Boone find at the end will not be unearthed by the next episode. In fact, it won't be opened until the very last scene of the season. This, ladies and gentlemen, is my problem with Season 1 in a nutshell. It treads so much water and stretches out every event and plot point, not because that is what was dramatically organic for the telling of the story, but because the writers were trying to figure out where this race they were running was going in the middle of running it. So I have mixed feelings about this episode. I enjoy it, the flashbacks are great, but there is the inescapable sense that despite all of the action and illusion of things happening, this is much closer to filler than it first appears. Who is Ethan? We previously discussed how Ethan Rom was an anagram for other man, and we will later discover that Ethan was born to the Goodspeeds, actually making him Ethan Goodspeed. By all accounts, he was the last baby to be born on the island before the incident of 1977, which caused the pregnancy crisis. Little is known about what happened to him during his childhood. What we do know is that the next decade saw Ethan growing up in the Dharma Initiative. He was adopted by the others either before or after the Purge, when the others wiped out the remnants of the Initiative. No doubt recruited by Benjamin Linus, who was an insider and a Dharma defector. We also know that Ethan will go on to study medicine and then will become the resident doctor of the others on the island, which makes his slugfest with Jack all the more layered, considering it is two doctors essentially fighting it out over who gets to be the primary caregiver for this pregnant woman. Due to the fact that he was the last island baby to ever be conceived and successfully brought to term on the island, it goes to underlining his motivations and obsessions with Claire. Between his time with Dharma and the others, he has no doubt seen all of the death that followed each group in their attempts to have children. I believe that is what drove his pursuit of medicine. In the Lost Missing Pieces mobisodes, there is a scene where Ethan talks to Jack, and in their conversation, Ethan drops a nugget of information in which he tells Jack that his wife and baby died in childbirth.
My wife died in childbirth, and our baby didn't make it either.
So that gave him extra motivation in trying to ensure that he would not be the last baby conceived and born in this place. Obviously, we only learn parts of his backstory in that mobisode and then later in Season 5, but it really helps to round off his actions and behaviours in Season 1. What's interesting is that when Ethan talks to Hurley and gives him the surname Rom, it means one of two things. Either he changed his surname long ago in order to distance himself from his Dharma heritage and his own parents, whom he turned away from, or he created the surname specifically for his cover story. In a roundabout way, the name change enriches his backstory a little bit, depending on how you choose to read it. Anyway, Ethan kidnaps Claire when he realises that his cover is about to be blown, and he grows to like her, albeit in a creepy fixation way. What is it with some of the others on the island being a bit stalkery?
After everything I did to get you here, after everything I've done to keep you here, how can you possibly not understand that you're mine?
Ethan knows that the baby is the priority and that Claire is expendable, and since he is committed to the cause and to Ben, and has shunned his parentage and people in the past, he is willing to sacrifice this woman for what he thinks is the greater good, the future health of the island. This is true zealotism, by the way. Thankfully, Claire is jailbreaked by another island baby, one who was not conceived there, but certainly was the last to be born on its shores. Claire is returned to her oceanic family, and Ethan is admonished and ordered to bring her back. Ethan's flaws, aka his zealotry, and his fixation with solving this pregnancy crisis that has affected him his entire life, is ultimately and ironically what leads to his demise. And most ironically, it turns out that Ethan was actually more expendable than Claire was. How did Ethan manage to kidnap two people on his own? This is a fair question. Even Jack raises the point and wonders how one man could have dragged two people off alone.
This doesn't make any sense. How could one man drag off two people, one of them pregnant?
You're asking the wrong question, not how. Why?
Locke also notes two separate trails leading in different directions, which means Ethan is either superhuman or he had some help. We discover later that Ethan is part of a larger group, many of whom are trained to carry out clandestine activities and have already kidnapped people en masse at the same time on the other side of the island. So the implication seems to be that Ethan rendezvoused with some others, handed off Claire to them to take her to the staff medical station, then dragged Charlie off in a separate direction in order to throw off any pursuers, especially since knowing that the oceanic passengers had a knowledgeable tracker amongst them in Locke, who just might be able to follow. In my opinion, it wasn't Charlie leaving his finger bandages like a sneaky trail of breadcrumbs for our losties to follow. It was actually Ethan, and it was a way for him to bait them in the wrong direction. Speaking of Charlie, why couldn't Charlie remember what happened to him?
I don't remember anything.
The penultimate scene of the episode sees Jack questioning Charlie as to what happened to him out there, but Charlie essentially suffers from what I like to call the writer's plot convenience, aka selective amnesia, which is a groan-inducing cliche we will see revisited again when Claire stumbles back into the camp with no memory. I think audiences gave his amnesia more slack upon first watch, especially because we were not sure if the others had some supernatural hooey to erase memories, because why else would Charlie neither see nor hear nor remember any details of his abduction? There wasn't enough time to take him to Hydra Island and wipe his memory in room 23, and it didn't appear that he was being drugged, as Claire was. The only possible explanation I can offer is this: that when Ethan snatched them, he used the stun darts that seem to be a weapon of choice that all others carry on them. He knocked out both Charlie and Claire so as to avoid any struggle, radioed for backup, and handed off Claire, then dragged Charlie off in the other direction, who would have been knocked out for the duration of the whole thing. I can't really imagine that Ethan, regardless of his strength, could subdue both Charlie and Claire simultaneously and drag them further into the jungle without any help. Indeed, I think the fact that Jack and Locke talk about this was an early indication that Ethan was not working alone. What's in the hatch? This was the question that drove the latter half of Season 1, and went on to become a defining mystery for the series as a whole, with an answer that no one could have predicted. Fundamentally, as far as the writers were concerned, whatever ended up being inside of this thing was going to be the reason for why the oceanic plane crashed in the first place. That is something that turns out to be true in more ways than one going forward. The hatch is essentially the back door of the Swan, an emergency escape hatch that was long ago sealed to make it impossible for people to gain access to it from outside. You can see that the staff medical station also has one of these. It's basically a built-in safety feature. Now, the Swan itself was conceived by scientist Stuart Brzezinski and the Dharma Initiative as a research station capable of studying the unique electromagnetic properties of the island up close and personal. This is the largest energy pocket that they have been able to locate thus far, and this pocket is connected to the source, which is the literal heart of the island. As previously discussed, that heart has water pumping in and out of it like a bloodstream, which creates a circulatory system that helps to sustain the other pockets of energy that are dotted around the island. Now, you can view these other pockets as arteries and organs, all of which are connected to the source and part of a larger whole. The Swan site is the second biggest organ on the island next to the heart. Now, there is a lot of untapped power down there, and the answer to the questions of our whole existence lie within this energy. Dharma believed that they could find a way to understand and wield it for the greater good, but in order to do that, they had to get close to the energy. Real close. As it turns out, they got too close and sprang a leak. Some time travelers appeared and kindly sealed it up for them, and that allowed them to complete the station, only for the leak to return, so they had to set up a system in which they could discharge the build-up of energy before it reached critical mass. The computer is connected to some sort of reactor that we never see. Presumably the reactor is harnessing the build-up of electromagnetic energy, and once it reaches capacity, every 108 minutes, the energy can be safely discharged. Two-man teams kept watch over this system for over 25 years, and pushing the button kept the pocket alive until the system finally failed in 2004, when Desmond failed to push the button in time, which resulted in Oceanic Flight 815 crashing on the island. It's best to view the Swan, its computer, and the reactor like a life support machine. If you unplug it now, then the organ will rupture, hemorrhage, and cause the island to bleed out, which in turn will destabilise the heart and collapse the entire circulatory system. If the heart dies, the island dies. If the island dies, we die. A lot of the mythology of Lost revolves around this particular geographical area and the events surrounding the construction and usage of the Swan Station. When Locke and Boone discover it for the first time at the end of this episode, they have no idea that they are knocking on the door of their own destiny, and indeed opening up the future possibilities of the series.
Are we lost?
Yes, Boone. Yes, we are. All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues is the first time in the series that a character gets a second flashback storyline, and of course that honour does go to Jack, who is the reigning champion of flashbacks. Flash forwards, and flash sideways storylines. He gets 3 flashbacks in this season alone, the previously discussed White Rabbit and the yet-to-be-covered Do No Harm. The frequency of this focus on Jack Shephard helps to separate him from the ensemble nature of the series, and to mark him out unquestionably as the lead character. So what constants does this episode bring us? Well, we see an early indication of the Jack versus Locke conflict rear its head when Jack challenges Locke.
If we catch up with him, I don't want anything to happen to the only trained physician on the island, so go back. Be the doctor. Let me be the hunter.
Can we go now?
I think this is the first time that Locke feels Jack wading into his territory as the group's hunter-tracker, and he clearly doesn't like it. In fact, he gets pissy about being second-guessed a bit later on.
You gonna take a break? It's gotta be almost 4 o'clock when the sun sets. There's no way.
4:25. Then yes, I'm taking a break.
It's a sign of things to come with these two. The man of science is starting to snipe at the man of faith, especially when Locke's more "let's just see what happens" attitude slams against Jack's more decisive "let's take action" approach. Jack wants to know how Ethan did this, whereas Locke wants to know why. That's a nice distinction between science and faith right there. Every Jack versus Locke scene is one to savour, even the little moments of static like this. Speaking of foreshadowing, there is an endearing scene between Hurley and Walt as they play backgammon, the game that Locke taught to Walt in the pilot, which involved a game between light and dark pieces. And now here we see the 2 future protectors of the island playing it together.
Come on, double sixes, double sixes.
Oh,
Yes!
you gotta be kidding me.
I'm lucky.
No one is that lucky.
Walt keeps winning, which I've seen some fans often claim is not simply down to luck or skill, but that Walt's powers are subconsciously influencing the game itself. He wants to win, and so the dice rolls in his favour every time. I really like this idea a lot, and I see no reason why it could not be the case. Walt has a more adaptable, positive mindset than Hurley, who also possesses powers that he isn't aware of. Only Hurley filters a lot of his experiences and outcomes through a negative lens. He believes he's cursed, so his powers don't always work in his favour the way they work for Walt. In fact, they actually work against Hurley, but we'll get to that when we talk about his centric episode Numbers later in the season. That's going to be really fun to cover. My favourite line in the whole episode happens here when the extent of the wager that Walt and Hurley made is revealed, and Walt says,
You owe me $20,000!
You'll get it.
Upon first watch, it seems like Hurley is just knowingly fobbing Walt off, but the fact is that Hurley is a millionaire and is good for the money, so this line works even better upon rewatch and is actually funnier in a whole new context. Walt has quite a few pointed remarks for characters in this episode. He catches Sawyer up on events, which indicates how ostracised Sawyer really is from the group. In response to the revelation about Ethan, Sawyer tries to make an excuse as to why someone might lie about who they really are, and Walt says,
It's stupid to lie about your name.
I suppose the irony here is that Walt will one day have to lie about his name once he's off the island, as will several different characters. Maybe Sawyer was just a trendsetter ahead of his time. Complaints about the hierarchy of the group dynamics emerge when Michael talks to Hurley about being left out of the main search party. Walt is once again cutting with his remarks when he undermines his father by essentially saying that Locke is the better man for the job.
Mr. Locke's a warrior. He can hunt, he can track stuff, and he's the only one who brought knives. So if it were me, I'd listen to him.
Well, I don't want you to.
And I think this sets up Michael's resentment towards Locke in a couple of episodes' time. But this is neither the first nor the last time that criticisms of who is and who is not in the Cool Club will come up. Dr. Arts will make a similar point also to Hurley in the season 1 finale. Boone and Shannon wrestle with feelings of being useless to their fellow survivors and find different ways to cope and deal with that. Boone attaches himself to the only true survivalist of the bunch, while Shannon attaches herself to a former soldier. To me, these are forms of social survival, and can be just as useful as being able to handle physically taxing labour. We'll also see the show satirically make a meta-commentary on these group dynamics and the hierarchy of things, with the divisive Nikki and Paolo arc in Season 3, particularly in their centric episode, Expose. There are often tongue-in-cheek acknowledgements about how much the focus of the group's activities boils down to Jack, Kate, Sawyer, Saeed, and Locke, and occasionally Hurley. I think this comes down to the fact that they are more proactive in high-stakes situations and more dominant when it comes to asserting their point of view, and I actually find this to be one of the more realistic aspects of how the show is written. There will always be a hierarchy of importance that emerges in any communal situation, especially in survival circumstances. Those who are physically capable and proactive often band together, while those less physically able or with less utility tend to get left to the side, and resentment often breeds between these two camps. In relation to hierarchy, Boone brings up red shirts when discussing being expendable. Locke doesn't know the term, so Boone explains that it was popularised from the original Star Trek series, in which Captain Kirk would always beam down to a planet with some of the main cast, and one or two unnamed background characters in red shirts, and those red shirts always got killed off. So this term red shirts went on to define characters who are really only introduced in order to be killed off. Now, there are several ironies worth pointing out here. The biggest one is that Boone is right. He is a red shirt. Not only does he have the red on him in this episode, but he is destined to be killed off. Granted, he is a main character, and not some minor background player like Scott and Steve.
Hey, Scott? I'm Steve. I'm Scott.
But it doesn't change the fact that his character fills that function from the main cast. And to add more irony into this festival of ironies, when Shannon fears for her brother's safety in this episode, Kate has this response to console her.
If there's anyone on this island that your brother's safe with, it's Locke.
And I think this is what adds fuel to Shannon's fire later when it comes to blaming Locke. Boone was supposed to be safe with him. Daddy issues alert coming up. So we all know that Jack clearly has a complex when it comes to his father, perhaps the most defined and well-drawn daddy issues of the entire series. I've already explored how they relate to his backstory in this episode and the previous Jack episode, White Rabbit, and his general dynamic with Christian. What I think is worth touching upon further is how those daddy issues actually impact his decision-making whilst he's on the island. It's not during the day-to-day leadership for the group in which the daddy issues rear their ugly head. They come into play whenever things go wrong. It's whenever Jack is faced with potential failure or calamity, such as someone dying like Boone or losing Claire to unknown forces. That is when the complex kicks in and he starts to react rather than think things through, as Sawyer later points out in Season 5 episode Namaste.
Because back when you were calling the shots, you pretty much just reacted. See, you didn't think, Jack.
And yeah, Sawyer is right. Jack was always too quick to anger, too quick to react. And that's the result of not having full control over his emotions, which is in part because he is still in a state of mourning and dealing with the guilt that he internalised over his father's death. All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues might be the first episode to really demonstrate how Jack is an imperfect leader, even though no one on the show demonstrates perfect leadership by any means. Even Hurley and Sawyer's decision in Season 6 inadvertently result in the deaths of their friends, and I think that actually helps them to realise just how hard it was for Jack, and certainly gives Sawyer a newfound respect for being the man in charge during a major life and death crisis. Nevertheless, it is in these moments of free fall and failure when Jack becomes a slave to his own patterns of behaviour, his own character flaws, worth keeping an eye on as we move forward. Our number count sees Kate recollecting how she spent 8 hours tracking a deer with her father when she was a kid. Walt blows on his magic dice 4 times to get the outcome that he wants. Charlie allegedly leaves a trail for his friends to follow, although I think it was more likely to be Ethan, but this trail consists of the 4 finger bands that spell out the word late, formerly fate. Now, the numbers are a little bit nebulous in this next example. This is one I saw on Lostpedia that actually made me laugh. Apparently, we see Jack hitting Charlie in the chest 23 times before giving up to grieve with Kate. I mean, that's what I love about this fandom. Someone out there actually counted how many times Jack's fist made contact with Charlie's chest. And I think this is why non-Lost fans probably think we're all nuts. Wear it proudly, my friends. Wear it proudly. Something else that's worth taking away from this is that Jack doesn't give up because something overcomes him. It's a voice from within, perhaps, something that tells him it's not Charlie's time to die yet, keep going. And what's fascinating about this whole sequence is that it kicks up all kinds of questions in regards to Charlie's fate. Before Season 5 introduced the concept of whatever happened happened, I used to think that Charlie was actually supposed to die here, but Jack's free will upended the plans of fate, and brought the rock star back to life, and that this might have been why the island was trying to kill Charlie later in season 3 in order to course correct that mistake. But Jack was so stubborn that he literally pushed death out of the way and said, "I got this." However, once it did become clear that whatever happened happened, and everything that happens is part of a causal chain of events, I viewed this scene differently. The fact is that Charlie couldn't die here, because he had a fate to fulfill in the Looking Glass. As already discussed, Jack has healing abilities, which might go beyond strictly being just medical skill. Could it be that the island is working through him to bring Charlie back to life? I mean, think about it. Jack's CPR has a very good law of averages. Perhaps that voice in Jack's head telling him to keep trying is not simply his stubbornness. Perhaps it is the unmistakable pull of fate itself. The feeling that draws us towards our destiny without us even realising it. It's also really fascinating to watch this scene in the context of the Flash Sideways, because many events that take place within the Sideways are comparable to events that took place on the island. In this case, Jack saves Charlie on the plane in a very similar way to how he saved him in the jungle, the two realities connecting and syncing up just for a moment, helping to build a bridge between life and death. In the next episode guide, we shall hit the brick wall that is, whatever the case may be, one of my least favourite episodes of Lost, and in my opinion, a total betrayal of the hot streak formed from the last several episodes. Make sure to join me for it. Please like, share and subscribe to keep the channel alive. As always, you can sign up to the Patreon to get early access to videos and some extra content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all back on the island.